warm welcome to Lecture 6 in our preparatory lecture series on the road to COP26 and CMA3. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome today Professor Salim Ul-Haq, who will speak to us about the perspective of the least developed countries on loss and damage from climate change. Now, as many of you will know already, this lecture series is jointly organized by the Center for International Law of the University of Singapore, the World Commission on Environmental Law of the IUCN, and Durham Law School. Now, Niloufer Roual was called to urgent matters of international legal nature at the very last minute today, and she sends her very best wishes to all of you, in particular to our speaker, to Salim. And I'm very pleased that I have my dear friend and colleague, Christina Vogt, with me. Christina is professor at the University of Oslo, and she serves as the co-chair of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee. She's also chair of the Climate Change Specialist Group of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and a member of the IUCN Climate Change Task Force, and she's well known to many of you already. Now, Dr. Salim Ul-Haq is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, ICCAD, and he's also professor at the Independent University of Bangladesh. He's also an associate of the International Institute on Environment and Development in the UK, as well as chair of the Expert Advisory Group for the Climate Vulnerable Forum. He also serves as a senior advisor on the locally led adaptation with Global Center on Adaptation, which is headquartered in the Netherlands. He's an expert in adaptation to climate change in the most vulnerable developing countries and has been a lead author of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And he also advises the Least Developed Countries Group in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So he has the insights from the negotiations on the floor now in the run-up as well to COP26, of course. He has published a huge number of scientific as well as popular articles on and was recognized as one of the top 20 global influencers on climate change in 2019, and he's a top scientist from Bangladesh on climate science. Now, the VASSAR International Mechanism was introduced as a 3rd action pillar, as you know, into the Paris Agreement next to mitigation and adaptation. And Article 8, paragraph 2 prescribes that the VASSAR International Mechanism for loss and damage associated with climate change impact shall be subject to the authority and guidance of the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the agreement, and it may be enhanced and strengthened as determined by the Conference of Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. Now, this mechanism has been instrumental, and it is designed to enhancing the knowledge and understanding of how countries are managing climate change impacts, including to enable them to better assess and plan for long-term transboundary and compound risk. The objective is to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And the impacts of climate change that are covered include slow onset events and extreme weather events, which may both result in loss and damage. Now, slow onset events refer to the risk and impacts of increasing temperatures, desertification, loss of biodiversity, land and forest degradation, glacial retreat and related impacts, ocean acidification, sea level rise, and salinization. And I know this is a particular problem as well in Bangladesh. Now, extreme weather events include heat waves, hurricanes, increased precipitation, and flooding. Now, the Executive Committee guides the implementation of the functions of the VASSAR International Mechanism, and it focuses on comprehensive risk management approaches, strengthening dialogue, coordination, coherence and synergies among stakeholders, and enhancing action and support, including finance, technology, and capacity building. Now, this work of the Executive Committee is carried out in 5 strategic work streams: slow onset events, non-economic losses, comprehensive risk management approaches, human mobility, and action and support. And the implementation of the activities under these work streams is supported by the thematic expert groups that then report to the executive committee. Now, there is no question that loss and damage are highly important topics and high on the agenda, and I'm looking forward to hearing more on this now from Salim, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Petra, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Let me start with an apology, or two apologies, in fact. The first one is that I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I'll just talk, if that's all right. And it can be a bit boring, I know, but I hope I can keep it lively. And secondly, I have something of a sore throat, so I may have to sip some water as I talk, and I may not be able to talk for too long. So perhaps, you know, I'll not make it a very long lecture, but maybe give time for some question and answer discussion towards the end. I think interactive discussion is often more useful than just listening to a lecture. So having said that, I will describe what I propose to share with you in three buckets. The first one is from my perspective as a climate change scientist working on climate change for now well over 2 decades, nearly 3 decades, I would say, and give you my impression of, you know, how the science of climate change has changed over that time, and how the perception of climate change and actions on climate change has also changed over that time. The second bit of what I will talk about is the least developed countries group, and also the climate vulnerable forum group of countries, which are two separate but interlinked groups of vulnerable countries that have come together in the negotiating space, the LDC group, and the political space, the Climate Vulnerable Forum. I'll share something about those groups. And then the final bit I'll talk about is the upcoming COP26, what are expectations of these groups of countries, both negotiating and political expectations, and then also beyond COP26, because COP26, we know, will simply not solve all our problems. We can have high hopes of it, but previous COPs have not fulfilled high hopes. So we have to be prepared for less than perfect outcomes in COP26 and a longer term perspective. So let me start with the evolution of the climate change problem. And this is my personal take. Others may have different ways of describing it. I characterize the climate change issue as having gone through two major eras and is now entering a third era. So what do I mean by that? The first era is, and let me just frame this by saying that the way anybody or we describe a problem in itself lays the groundwork for what is the solution of that problem. If you describe a problem one way, then there's one solution. If you describe the problem in another way, then there's another solution. So the initial era was an environmental problem. There are these gases called greenhouse gases. They go into the atmosphere, they capture the sun's rays, they raise the temperature of the atmosphere, and that's the problem. The problem is greenhouse gas emissions. And so the solution then is, let's stop producing them or reduce them. And that's what we did. So we had the Framework Convention that said, yes, these are bad things. We don't want them. We should reduce them. Everybody agrees we should reduce them. And in the climate change jargon or parlance, we call that mitigation. So mitigation, problem, emissions of greenhouse gases, solution, reduce those gases, production of those gases by mitigation. That still remains a number one issue. The era has not ended. It has not disappeared, but it was what kicked us off. Then around the turn of the century, and this is, I characterize this as happening when the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out in 2001, we had a new problem, which was that the emissions are continuing, temperature is rising, and in the short term, the next 10, 20 years, there's going to be an inevitable rise in temperature, which will cause inevitable impacts on people around the world. And we need to be prepared for that. So the second order or era, the problem is now inevitable impacts, unavoidable impacts. And therefore, for those unavoidable impacts, no matter what emission reduction we do, we will still have them. We have to adapt, we have to prepare. So we now have a new era of impacts and adaptation being the solution. Impacts the problem, adaptation the solution. And that's really where I entered the scene on climate change. I started around 2001. I was the lead author of the IPCC third assessment report. And that's when I started working on adaptation. It's the third assessment report, by the way, of the IPCC is the first time they did adaptation. IPCC first report, second report was all mitigation, no adaptation. The third report was the first time they did adaptation. And I've been associated with the IPCC ever since on adaptation, and adaptation has grown. So there are two aspects of adaptation, though. And they also, these are important to note in terms of who is involved. So the first era with the environment, it was ministers of environment who went to the COPs. It was ministries of environment. It was people involved in the environment field, NGOs who are environmental NGOs like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth. Not other NGOs. In the second era, as we entered the second era after the third assessment report of the IPCC in 2001, we brought in the development world, because one of the aspects of adaptation or impacts is that not impacts will happen to everybody everywhere sooner or later, but they're going to happen sooner to the poorest people on the planet. And that is a very important part of the message of impacts, that it now has a equity dimension, who is going to be affected dimension. And as it happens, poorest people in the planet are going to be affected first and hardest. And so people who are working on poverty alleviation, working with poor people, didn't understand or engage with climate change, now needed to understand and engage climate change, because they were going to be affected. Their work was going to be affected. And that's to a very large extent my career in this field. I started off in 2001 as the head of the climate change program at IIED, the International Institute for Environment and Development in London. And it was to bring these two worlds together, the environment world and the development world, which were at that time very separate. They're now much together. At that time, they were two different worlds. And I used to describe my job as half the time I talk to the environmentalists and explain to them development, which they don't understand. And the other half I talk to development people and explain environment, which they don't understand either. So being an ambassador or a bridge between these two worlds, environment and development. And I'll just give you one example from UK, which you will, I think, appreciate or relate to, which is that when I started doing this work in the UK in London at IIED, the then development minister was Claire Short. This is under Tony Blair. And Claire Short, for those of you who know her or know of her, was a very passionate individual. You know, she passionately believed in development and helping poor countries. And I had an opportunity to meet with her and talk to her about climate change. She said, don't talk to me about climate change. It's got nothing to do with poverty alleviation. It's about, you know, what's going to happen 100 years from now. I am talking about poor people today. How can we help them today? And that shut me up. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't going to convince her. But then a very short period after that, after she left the department and Hilary Benn became the Secretary of State, I had an opportunity to talk to him, but you know, I don't want to claim credit for this, but he initiated a rethink in DFID. He made DFID look at climate change seriously and write a white paper on the role of the link between climate change and development. And since then, DFID, and not just DFID, all the development world banks, the Asian Development Bank, different development sectors, development NGOs, Oxfam, Christian Aid, all of these. I used to spend a lot of my time would be going and talking to these development NGOs, telling them about climate change and saying, guys, you may not think climate change is important for you, but it is. You need to be, you need to know about it. And in fact, one of the things I did at that time was I set up an event at the COP called the Development and Climate Days at the COP to invite these development NGOs who didn't come to a climate change conference before to come and see the relevance of climate change for their work. And that is still continuing. My institution, IID, is still continuing that Climate and Development Days event at the COPs now for many years. So bridging these two worlds, the development world and the environment world more generally. And that is what I call the second era. And that has now expanded. Now when I started talking about adaptation, people used to say, what is this? We don't know what this is. And now that's no longer the case. It has been incorporated, and it's been given equal status with mitigation now. So, we have a global goal on mitigation of 1.5. We have a global goal on adaptation in Article 7 of the Paris Agreement. We don't know what that is, but we have a global goal. So it's been given importance. Now, we are now coming up to what I call the third era. And the third era is a very different formulation of the problem, and therefore a different formulation of what the solution to the problem is. The third era, in my view, is a justice formulation. Climate change is a problem caused by rich people in rich countries that poor people in poor countries are going to suffer the consequences of. And that's not right. It's a moral issue. That's unjust. It's not even an issue of justice. It's an issue of injustice. It's manifest injustice. And when you put this to most people, they see that immediately. The Pope sees it. In Laudato Si, he has said, and under many religions, this is wrong. Any religious teaching that you have, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu, this is wrong. You should not be harming people. And if you know you're harming them, you should stop harming them. And so this is a very different formulation. It has nothing to do with greenhouse gases, nothing to do with, impacts and scenarios and models. It's just human beings. It's just not right that rich people cause problems for poor people and they don't take any responsibility. They have to take some responsibility. They have to do something about it. And it's in this final, era, and I call this an emerging era. We're now 2021 is the first year of this decade. This is going to be the decade of loss and damage. And loss and damage is the quintessential humanitarian stroke moral aspect of climate change. It's not right. And if you look at the Fridays for Future school kids doing their strike every Friday, including today, under the leadership of Greta Thunberg, they are bringing this out. It's not right. It's wrong. We must do something about it. It should not be allowed. It's a moral case to every human being on the planet. We should oppose it. We should say something should be done. And all of us need to be involved. This is not something that we leave to our leaders to do. And if they don't do it, it's nothing much I can do. We need to think about what role we can play. So, and I see this just beginning to unfold. We are at the beginning of this third era of climate change. And in the more technical aspects of climate change, this is what loss and damage is. Loss and damage is a very odd phrase to be using. And, that's why we end up in climate change negotiations with odd terminologies. But it is a very simple issue. It's an issue of injustice. Rich people making poor people suffer. And that's not right. That's wrong. Okay, so that's my 2 cents worth on the moral and the three eras. Let me now move to the UNFCCC process and the formation of the least developed countries group. Now, in the original framework convention, the least developed countries, which are 48 of the poorest countries in the world, most of them, some in Asia, including my country, Bangladesh, they have been identified in Article 4.8 of the original convention as one of the particularly vulnerable groups of countries, the others being small island developing states and the continent of Africa. So there are three groups of countries identified as particularly vulnerable. There's overlaps between them. A lot of the LDCs are in Africa, as I said, they belong to the Africa group. Many small islands are also LDCs. So if you take these three groups into account, there's about 48 LDCs, 56 African countries, nearly 50 island states. If you take the overlaps into account, we're talking about just over 100 countries. So 100 is an important number to remember. I think it's 101 or 102. That number is a majority in the UN Framework Convention. The Framework Convention has 195 countries. So 101 is a majority. It's also within all of these countries belong to the group of 77 in China, which is the umbrella group for all developing countries, which currently has 136 countries. So within the G77 in China, these three vulnerable country groups are a supermajority. They're more than 2/3 within G77 in China. But unfortunately, neither within the G77 in China group nor in the bigger 195 countries UNFCCC group do their voices appear. You know, even in G77 in China, China dominates, India dominates, Brazil dominates, South Africa dominates. Small countries like Bangladesh and Fiji and Maldives and Mali, their voices, even within the developing countries, are not heard much unless they come together. And that's where the least developed countries got together. They started in COP26 in The Hague, and I was very much one of the people that got them to form a group. And ever since then, I have been advising the least developed countries group in the negotiations. Initially on the topic of adaptation, and one of the quick wins they had was in COP7, a year later in Marrakesh, they got something called the Marrakesh Accords on adaptation. It's the first time the UNFCCC actually did something on adaptation, recognizing the least developed countries as a vulnerable group. And so ever since then, the LDC group has evolved and been working on issues of adaptation because they're vulnerable. But more recently, on loss and damage. And again, I've been advising them on the issue of loss and damage, which historically has been primarily an issue of the small island states, AOSIS. They were the champions of loss and damage. The LDCs joined them later in Cancun, in fact, and that's how we got the Cancun agreement that mentioned loss and damage. And ever since then, in Doha and then in Warsaw, we actually achieved the Warsaw International Mechanism at COP19 in Warsaw together, the vulnerable countries working together. And as Petra just read out at the very beginning, the Warsaw International Mechanism is now up and running. It's doing a lot of very good things, but it's not doing enough. And in the last COP, in COP25 in Madrid, we, the vulnerable countries, and I've been working very closely with the vulnerable countries on this, had two demands. The first demand was to have a technical support wing or institution set up under the Warsaw International Mechanism beyond the executive committee to support countries on how to deal with loss and damage, how to understand it, how to use it, how to do something about it. And then a second demand was for financing loss and damage. And that is something that has been a highly politically sensitive issue for the developed countries. And this topic was one of the topics that took COP25 in Madrid into overtime. Those of you who either were there or followed it would know it was supposed to have finished on a Friday evening. It's a 2-week-long event, starts on one Monday, supposed to end Friday of the second week. It went on all night Friday, all day Saturday, all night Saturday, and then half day on Sunday. 2.5 days extra time was involved in getting an agreement. And even then, in the end, they didn't agree everything. So we got half of what we wanted, the smaller half. The bigger half we didn't get. The smaller half was they agreed to set up something called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, the technical arm that I mentioned. But they didn't agree on finance. Okay, so we didn't get the bigger ask that we had. Now, what's going to happen going forward? As you know, COP26 was supposed to have been in Glasgow in November 2020. It's been postponed by a year to November 2021. Hopefully it will happen. But the postponement is a very interesting byproduct, I think, that people haven't realized. It was postponed for valid reasons for the pandemic, but the 12-month postponement didn't postpone climate change. Climate change went on, even though we were busy with the pandemic. And I would say that climate change actually crossed a threshold between November 2020 and November 2021, where we are now already very, very clearly and scientifically, credibly, attributably in the era of human-induced climate change. Right now, you can see heat waves in North America, in Northwestern America, and Canada, and the US. Over the last 3 days, they had, I think it was Monday, Tuesday, and then Wednesday. Monday, the highest temperature ever by a huge margin of 4 degrees. And then Tuesday became the highest temperature ever above Monday. And then Wednesday was the highest temperature ever above Tuesday. And then they had wildfires as a result of that. And people are evacuating towns in Canada right now. That is attributable to human-induced climate change. And so are many other events taking place around the world. So my point is that we have just entered into the era of attributable, visible impacts of climate change attributable to human-induced climate change, causing loss and damage to people before our eyes, including climate refugees and climate migrants. This then makes the issue of loss and damage not just something to negotiate, but a reality on the ground. And reality, in my mind, trumps negotiations by orders of magnitude. We have to deal with the reality now. That's why, Greta quite rightly calls this a crisis or an emergency. It's an emergency. So in an emergency, you don't talk about how we're going to deal with something in the future. You deal with the emergency. And that's not happening. And unfortunately, the prospects that we are seeing in the discussions around the preparations for COP26, we are not seeing from the COP presidency or from the developed countries any appetite for taking loss and damage seriously. They are talking about the Santiago Network and how to set that up, and that is a trivial issue. When I say loss and damage, if they say Santiago Network, then that is in itself, in my view, bad faith. It's trivializing a problem that is much, much bigger than can be confined to these mundane negotiations that they've done so far. So I'll end by sharing a few things that have happened in the last few months. Let me give you a little bit of background first. I mentioned earlier that the group of least developed countries are the negotiating groups, the LDCs, a group, the AOSIS, Small Islands, Africa group, etc. At the political level, 11 years ago, just before the Copenhagen conference, at that time, President Nasheed was the president of the Maldives. He invited the heads of government from the different groups together in Malé, in the Maldives, to form, and they came and they formed something called the Climate Vulnerable Forum. Over time, that forum has expanded to 48 countries. It started with about 20. And every 2 years, the leadership has gone from one head of government to another head of government. It recently went from President Hilda Hine of the Marshall Islands to Sheikh Hasina, Prime Minister of Bangladesh. So my Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, has now become the chair of the group for 2 years, which will cover both COP26 and COP27. Under this Climate Vulnerable Forum political group, its biggest achievement and biggest issue has always been pushing for the 1.5 degree goal against a lot of odds. And so the Paris Agreement was where they pushed hardest for the 1.5 degree goal, and they got it. At that time, the chair of the group was President Aquino of the Philippines. And against very stiff opposition, we managed to get 1.5 incorporated into the Paris Agreement. And reaching 1.5 is still the number one political ambition. So we're not on track to get to 1.5, but at least now countries are talking about 1.5. You know, the US and the Americans talking about 1.5 now is a big achievement. You know, in Paris they didn't want to talk about it, but now they are, and so that's a good thing. The fact that we're not on track to reach it is a bad thing. So we need to enhance ambition in the NDCs that countries are producing is something that is being advocated for. But under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, she has also added a new political demand from the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is on loss and damage. So loss and damage is now a political issue under the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, under the chairmanship of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. Now, as I said, the Climate Vulnerable Forum are not negotiators. They negotiate in their own groups at the negotiating level, but it's a political group. And in the last couple of months, in fact, President Biden's climate envoy, John Kerry, flew to Dhaka, met with the Prime Minister, and then a few weeks later, Alok Sharma, the incoming COP26 president, flew to Dhaka and met with her. On both occasions, John Kerry and Alok Sharma were also invited for a lunch and discussion by the foreign minister, where he kindly invited me to join them. And on both occasions, both John Kerry and Alok Sharma were told in no uncertain terms that loss and damage was a make or break issue for COP26, and they had to take it seriously. So far, we haven't seen them do that. And so let us see what happens. Maybe I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Salim. That was really insightful and very interesting, and not a problem at all to talk without slides, by the way. I think it's really engaging to do it this way, and I give you some moments to moisture your voice as well. Really sorry, and really glad that you still are here with us and share these views of yours with us. It's very concerning what is happening and what you've described here in terms of loss and damage occurring in front of our eyes. And I think I've got two questions, if I can start with that, but also encourage the audience to put all your questions in the Q&A section if that is possible. And I've got a specific question later for Christina as well on Ecocide. I think that is another really important aspect that we might loop into this discussion. Now, my question relates to maybe one legal issue and one scientific issue. So the legal issue is, you know, the COP decision with which the Paris Agreement was adopted explicitly, as we all know, exempted liability from Article 8. But that was a COP decision. Now the WIM is really guided by the CMA. Is there any leeway in or political will or prospect of taking this up again, opening the discussion and changing a COP decision with the CMA decision. And that, of course, relates to this wider issue of who's giving the mandate to this mechanism. Is it only the CMA or the COP? I think it is, from the report that the executive committee produced, clear that they expect to have mandates coming from both, but would be really interesting to see what you think about this. And the scientific question I have is, attribution science now plays an increased role in some litigation scenarios. It maybe hasn't been taken forward as much as it could have been, and there are new studies coming out. In fact, one was published this week in which I was lucky to participate, that says that we can fill the evidentiary gap in climate litigation with attribution science. Now that of course has also an aspect or a relevance under loss and damage. So do you see the chance to take the political will forward based on this new scientific evidence? So these two questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. So the first question on the sort of dichotomy between the COP and the CMA of the Paris Agreement. In my view, and this is, I think, the view of the least developed countries, that this is unresolved. It can be both. We have Article 8 in the Paris Agreement. We have the WIM decision under COP. There's I think a view that it should remain under the COP, but it should also be taken up under the CMA in Article 8. How that will be resolved, I'm not quite very clear. I don't get into the nitty-gritty of the negotiations. On the attribution question, I think that is extremely important. And as I said, attribution science has now come a long, long way, and it has become much, much better. Let me give you an example. In my part of the world here in Bangladesh, we regularly face cyclones that come from the Bay of Bengal and hit Bangladesh, Myanmar, or India to either side of us. These are natural phenomena. They happen all the time. They happen every year. Sometimes we have very severe ones, or we used to have them, which used to kill hundreds of thousands of people, in fact, the very severe cyclones. Now, in May of 2020, just over a year ago, we had a super cyclone. It was called Amphan, which became a super cyclone while it was sitting in the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, because the sea surface temperature was 2 degrees above normal. And the intensity of a cyclone or a hurricane or a typhoon, the words are the phenomena is the same, the words are used in different parts of the world, is a function of sea surface temperature. The higher the sea surface temperature, the more intense the cyclone. Cyclone is not caused by it, but it becomes more intense. And so we had a super cyclone Amphan that hit India, West Bengal, Kolkata, and then Bangladesh. Fortunately, Bangladesh, in the meantime, over the last decade, has what I would characterize as the most successful and effective early warning and evacuation and shelter system in the whole world. 3 million people got warnings. They knew what to do. They knew where to go. They took shelter. They survived. The death toll, which, as I said, in previous decades would be hundreds of thousands, was only a few dozen. And most of them were fishermen out at sea who didn't get back to land in time. Almost everybody who was on land went and got shelter and survived. Now, this is well over a year ago. Just last month, in May, or a month and a half ago, we sent a bunch of our researchers and journalists to go and visit that area. And there are tens of thousands of people who have not been able to go home. Their homes were destroyed, or their agricultural land was destroyed or salinized with seawater that came in. And so they are living in either embankments near their homes or in the slums of Khulna city, which is the nearest city, or in the slums of Dhaka city. That is loss and damage from climate change. All right. We saved their lives. They didn't lose their lives, but they lost their livelihoods. They lost their homes. They lost their their means of survival. And that is genuine loss and damage from a super cyclone that became a super cyclone because the sea surface temperature was 2 degrees above normal. And we're seeing this fingerprint of human-induced climate change attribution happening over and over again, all over the world. Every event from now on is no longer a 100% natural event. It is a certain percent of human-induced. We don't know how much, 1%, 2%, 10%. That scientists will figure out and tell us, but it certainly isn't zero. And therefore, there is an element of unnatural, man-made, human-induced element to the impacts that are going to happen, are happening and will happen. And this will become more and more transparent over time. That's why I said we're just starting. Loss and damage story is just beginning. It's not ending now. You know, Warsaw was a long time ago, it was just talking. It was a talk shop. Now it's reality on the ground. And reality is going to be far more compelling than just talking about, you know, Article 8 and, you know, CMA and executive committee. These are jargon terms that, you know, those of us who are in this process love to use, but have no resonance with the wider public. But the wider public understands climate impacts. Right now, the people in the town of Lytton in Canada have just evacuated their town. They have become climate refugees as we speak right now. That's loss and damage from climate change.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very thoughtful. I think the only problem we have is that we need to use the law as it is and the avenues that have been established to drive this forward and to make progress. So it's we have to live with the inadequacy of the system and try to improve it. I think that's the main hurdle here. So we've got a question now from Linda Siegler, and she's asking, regarding the characterization of era 3, rich countries causing damage in poor countries, how do emerging emitters in the developing world fit into this paradigm?
Yeah, Linda is a very experienced lawyer in this field. She knows more of these answers than I do. But I'll give you my take on that. So I use the phrase rich people and rich countries. I don't use exclusively rich countries. So there are rich people in poor countries. I'm a rich person in Bangladesh, in Bangladeshi terms. So I am in the category of rich people causing the problem. And there are rich people in developing countries in the millions. But it's mostly rich people in rich countries, all right, who are the bigger emitters, who are causing the problem. And poor people in all countries. Even if you look at the impacts of climate change in the US or in Canada right now, who are the people got affected? You know, the town of Lytton is an indigenous community. If you look at the people who are impacted in Europe and America, it happens to be the poorest people in those towns and those cities and those countries. It's very similar to how COVID is affecting people. COVID is not a uniform, it's not equitable distribution of people dying. It's the same thing with climate change. It's an inequitable impact of climate change on poorest people in every country. And so I make a distinction between poor people and rich people, wherever they may be living. We, the rich, and I assume everybody on this call will fall in the category of rich because our carbon footprint is above the average, are the causes of the problem, are the polluters. We must take our responsibility. And I belong in the polluter category. I don't belong in the victim category. The victims are outside my window here. They are on the streets of Dhaka. I'm not a victim. And so, you know, characterizing it as just countries loses that nuance. Obviously, countries like China, India, who are now big emitters, also have to take responsibility.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think we can probably all agree that what is really needed is solidarity here between different groups of peoples and countries and generations, quite frankly, as well. I will ask one more question from the Q&A, and then I will ask the question about the Ecocide. So Benoit Meyer is asking, saying, first of all, many thanks for a very informative lecture. And now the question is, as you know, the negotiations on loss and damage have led to several initiatives relating to the impact of climate change on human migration. Could you tell us more about this how this topic has become so prominent, and in particular, what has been the position of the least developed countries, vulnerable countries, on the inclusion of this topic within the loss and damage agenda?
Great, excellent question, Benoit. So the issue of climate-induced migration is sort of something that is being discussed in many different circles in many different ways, particularly in the realm of migration and security issues and so on. In the UNFCCC process, as you are quite well aware, we don't use climate migration. The term doesn't exist. We use displacement due to climate change impacts, and that happens to fall under loss and damage. So the topic of climate migration in general parlance in the UNFCCC process is a subset of loss and damage, all right? And as you know, there's a task force on migration. They produced a report, and there's lots of things discussed about it. The Article 8 of the Paris Agreement specifically talks about the issue of human-induced displacement that needs to be taken into account, and mobility and so on. That's where the two intersect in the UNFCCC process. Now, at the global level, as I mentioned, in the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is a political forum, not a negotiating forum, under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's leadership and our Foreign Minister, Dr. Momen, they are very concerned about forced migration and displacement, because Bangladesh is already seeing that happen, all right? And they have understood that in the UNFCCC process, that's a loss and damage issue. And so their interest in loss and damage actually comes from their concern about forced migration due to climate change, which is happening right now as we speak in Bangladesh. I mentioned people losing their livelihoods and their homes in the coastal zone and moving into Dhaka city. Every day, thousands of people are coming into Dhaka city. Major concern. Many of them are now climate migrants. And so that is a, if you like, a juxtaposition of a general knowledge about climate migration, which is a reality, whatever one wants to call it, and how it gets construed in the UNFCCC process under loss and damage. And therefore, loss and damage has now become a political issue for the government of Bangladesh, which it wasn't before. It didn't take it that seriously. It was a negotiating issue, but not a political issue. And so that's another aspect of my argument, that as of 2021, loss and damage, although we may not realize it, but I'm predicting, is going to blow up. Climate change is going to be all about loss and damage, and dealing with it. It's going to take all the oxygen out of everything else. How are you going to deal with the loss and damage, the real reality of loss and damage from climate change? And, tinkering around the edges with the agreements that we have, and how do we make them better and improve them and implement them, is, in my mind, an insufficient way of dealing with it. We need that. I'm not saying we don't do that, by no means, but I'm just saying it's not enough.
Thank you very much, Salim. So, when you started with your lecture, I thought it was very interesting how you brought together the aspect of development and adaptation, and how these two weren't really influenced or cross-fertilized by each other as, separate streams of development and political issues. And I think Article 8, especially in paragraph 5, invites taking into account issues that arise elsewhere. So I was wondering if perhaps Christina could tell us a little bit more about an initiative that she has been leading around Ecocide and the definition of Ecocide. Now, I'm fully aware that this relates to international criminal law, but nevertheless, could this perhaps be taken to take forward the political agenda under Article 8? And is there any room, any space for cross-fertilization and influencing these two different streams in a similar way? Christina.
Thank you, Petra, for Really difficult question, but I first of all and foremost would like to thank Professor Haag for your very engaging lecture. Thank you so much for being with us here today, and also for sharing with us and the audience your significant knowledge and competence in this important field. Well, Petra, to your question about ecocide, I mean, as we know, the idea of ecocide, the most serious environmental crimes, has been around for a while. And the Stop Ecocide Foundation last week or 2 weeks ago, I can't even remember, launched a suggestion for a possible definition prepared by an international panel of lawyers. And I had the honor to serve on that panel together with 11 other lawyers. So we've been quite a group. And it's only that, it's only a proposal. It's a suggestion where this group says, look, this is how it could look like. This is how you could possibly define ecocide. Now, when we worked on this definition, we had some exercises about what kind of scenarios do we see in our heads could be captured by that definition. And amongst many different things, climate damages, of course, were also something that we discussed and that we did try to capture by the definition, which in itself is general and abstract, and it had to be general and abstract to capture many different scenarios. Now, if you look at the definition, severe and either widespread or long-term environmental damage would capture the kind of climate losses and damages that we've heard and that were described by Professor Haag. I don't think there's any doubt about it. We defined environment in a way that it would include the atmosphere and other spheres of the earth, but also impact on humans. So it could be both, it could be either, that would be captured. What is, of course, a challenge, and here I do invite lawyers worldwide to think about it, is which acts would be covered, because most of the climate emissions happen legally, and there's not really necessarily an illegal act that we have there. Either it happens within domestic legal frameworks or emissions trading or what have you, and as long as you don't exceed the cap, it is a fairly clearly legal endeavor. And here the issue came in how to capture acts that are legal, but still have the potential to cause significant environmental damage. And we introduced in this context the element of wantonness, where the environmental damage is disproportionate or excessive to the anticipated social or economic benefits. And I think if we look into the scenario of climate impacts now and in the future, the closer we get to 1.5 degrees warming, and hopefully not beyond, that balancing of what is proportionate, what is excessive, is perhaps the one that will define where the threshold to crime lies. And again, I can only invite lawyers worldwide to consider that and find a constructive way forward of how to capture this problem, also outside the climate negotiations, maybe in the context of law, international law, and perhaps litigation.
Thank you very much, Christina. I think that's absolutely fascinating and very important work that you've been doing there with the group of lawyers. And I hope there are some PhD students in the audience, because Christina has just done half of the work for you and identified topics for further PhD studies. So this is normally something that is a challenging task, but this has now already been done. I think there are really further questions that need to be asked, and also maybe tied in with the UNFCCC regime at one point. Now I will return to the questions in the Q&A section here. So we've got one from Peter Musgrave. What is Sheikh Hasina's stance to coal-fired power stations and brick fields in Bangladesh, and how does this relate to loss and damage?
That's a very good question. It's also an interesting question in that the attitude, my characterization of this, has changed quite considerably. And this is a generalization for developing countries and also specific to my country, Bangladesh. Developing countries, by and large, have for many years argued that we are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We need to focus on adaptation. We don't need to do mitigation. Let the developed countries who cause the problem do the mitigation. Is not our problem. Mitigation isn't our problem. That used to a very large extent, be our argument everywhere. The Indians did it, the Chinese did it, we did it. And the use of coal-fired plants was a means of, making this argument. We have cheap coal, we should use it. You used it when you were developing, now you're telling us not to use it. That's not fair. That argument has shifted very, very considerably, I can tell you. And so Bangladesh had a whole slew of coal-fired power plants on the planning table. They have just cancelled 10 of them. The government of Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina, the prime minister, said, no more coal. There are a couple that have already moved quite far in terms of implementation, where it's going to be difficult for them to stop them. But the ones that were on the drawing board have been cancelled. And that, to me, is a very big sign that they're listening. They realize this. There are a number of other reasons why they do it as well, but this is one of the definitely. And you see the same thing happening in China and India. There are debates going on. Is it good for us to use our coal, even if we can use our coal? And these are good debates to have, because every country should make its own decision as to which way they should go. And they should develop as cleanly as they can. And clean development now becomes a desirable goal in and of itself, not because there's a global agreement that tells me I can't do it, but because it's good for me. And that's also the argument in the United States of America. In the US, it's not, that they have to stop coal because they're being told to do it. It's because it's the best thing to do. Green energy is the way to go in the US. And that's how Biden is selling it, as green jobs and green investment. And that's the way it should happen everywhere. And it is happening. The trajectory of renewable energy has taken off in a very, very significant way, which is going to make coal already redundant. The days of coal are dead almost. It's a dying industry. Petroleum will follow and natural gas will follow. These are regardless of UNFCCC decisions, by the way. This is just global economics.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's just hope it's happening all quickly enough, especially
exactly.
Fuel,
Can we make it go faster? That's the point.
Yes, absolutely. But I agree. I mean, with coal and especially climate litigation actually has helped to drive this agenda forward to take
absolutely. We all play. Everybody has to play a part. We all have to do our bit.
Yes. Again, that brings us back to the topic of solidarity, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I've got a further question here, and I think there are probably two in there, and that is from Nyunchu Justice Sama, an environmental lawyer from Cameroon. And the question is, how do we establish a legal mechanism for compensation or liability on cost of damage for climate change caused to developed countries by big polluters? This should be considered within the context of the current climate injustice and disproportionate burden on LDCs. And so I think closely related, but it's slightly different now, is can we exploit the Paris Agreement to ensure such compensation, or do we go to COP26 and look forward to establishing a legal mechanism to that effect? So I suppose that's about changing maybe the Paris Agreement and introducing perhaps a liability provision again. Thank you.
So these are very interesting and pertinent questions. I'll give you my personal opinions. These are not views of any particular parties. In my opinion, the UN Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement are not necessarily the best venues to talk about compensation and liability. First of all, it's already been, denatured in the Paris Agreement COP21 decision inserted by John Kerry on behalf of President Obama, saying that Article 8 cannot be used for liability and compensation. So that's a constraint. But in my view, even if we could, it's not the best place. I mean, the UNFCCC is a treaty. It's not a court of law. It is a place where everybody has to agree by consensus. And if they don't do something, there's not much recourse to take them to task. On the other hand, so international law, and you're all lawyers, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. International law is not like national law, where you can be punished and put into jail. In international law, there can be name and shame, sanctions, all kinds of stuff, but very little recourse to imposing justice on regimes that either, harm their own people, like the regime in Myanmar today, getting away with murder. Nothing we can do about it, or harming other countries. So a treaty is not the place to do this, in my view. National law, maybe, and as you all know, you're all lawyers, there are lots of cases taking place under US national law. We just had the Dutch national legal system impose a penalty on Shell. Big win. So national cases, in Australia, there's a case by kids, children, making cases against their own adults for destroying their lives in the future. National law is a place where you can actually have legal recourse, and that's taking place. International law is more difficult. It's not impossible. Some country may take a case to the International Court of Justice at some point. We're not seeing that yet, but you never know, it might happen. But these are liability and compensation are legal concepts, not treaty concepts. And so they need to be done under a legal framing, which the UNFCCC is not a legal body in that sense. It can have some penalties in it, but we've got a lot of experience. We had the strongest legal penalty was the Kyoto Protocol. There were penalties for non-compliance, and countries got away with non-compliance. And those penalties could not be imposed, even though they existed on paper. So there's a limit to how much we can expect out of a process like the UN Framework Convention. We shouldn't have false expectations of being able to solve that problem there. That's why I said, the loss and damage is now out of the box. It's not in a UNFCCC box anymore. It's in everywhere. It's all over the place. And all of us need to be figuring out how we can deal with it and help each other in the principle of solidarity, as you have said several times.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that is really a big chapter to discuss. It's almost a lecture on its own, how to bring a case to the ICJ or to ITLOS, because of sea level rise, for example. So there are, of course, mechanisms that could be explored in order to make this an international climate litigation case. There are further questions, so if I'm allowed to go further into this section.
Yeah, I'll have to leave in a few minutes if you don't mind, but I'm happy to take a couple more.
That's fine. So I will maybe take this one last question, and the others we will save and see that we can answer them on via email, for example. Now this one refers to children. So there are many children on the street, and they became more vulnerable due to the environmental impacts, but also during the times of COVID. And is this not a justifiable allegation that richest countries are directly liable for these vulnerabilities of children? So maybe this ties into the claim as well as being made, or the approach of children to the Convention on the Right of the Child and the obligation of states thereunder. So maybe you can give your thoughts on that final question. Thank you.
So yes, my short answer is yes. The long answer is how. And the how doesn't have a real answer to it. I mean, we can assert it. They should, all right? I've agreed. Yeah, whoever gave the question and I have agreed. But that hasn't moved an iota of difference to these poor children themselves. So I think a more relevant question is for us, how can we do something that will actually help them? And to me, that is really the crux of why we should do something. It is to help the victims. Each of us in our own sphere, you're a professor of law, you do it in your capacity. I'm a professor of environment, I do it in my capacity. Negotiators do it in their capacity. NGOs do it in their capacity. But we all need to be joining forces. That's why, I started off by this being, characterizing it as a moral issue for every single one of us to recognize that we have a responsibility. These children, I have a responsibility to do something for them. I don't want to fob it off by saying somebody else is responsible and they're not doing something. That's not good enough. What am I doing? And we need to ask ourselves, each of us, what am I doing? Can I do more? And if so, what is it that I can do? And who can I do it with? Who are allies I can join forces with? Maybe that's a good place to stop.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, we've taken up a lot of your time, and thank you so much. It was extremely insightful, very thought-provoking as well, especially through these tying in of moral issues into the scientific but also legal aspects. And thank you again very much for sharing your insights, your experience, your rich experience on these negotiations with us today. Thank you also to the audience who've really asked very engaging questions. And I like the idea that this was more interactive. It was really a great lecture again. We have the next lecture already coming up. Now we've got 2 lectures in July. So on the 30th of July, we will have lecture 7, and that will be delivered by Selam Kidane Abebi, who is a legal advisor for the African Group of Negotiators. And she will talk about the global goal for adaptation for raising ambition under the Paris Agreement. So again, something that is really very, very relevant next to mitigation and loss and damage. So please come and join us again on the 30th of July. Thank you again also to Stan for your tremendous support and for providing everything and helping us out with any issues and questions that arise behind the scenes. Thank you so much. And the recording will be made available again and distributed and via social media as well. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much.